Folks! So the plan for today's video was to discuss the conflict between liberalism and more radical currents in relation specifically to the first X-Men movie. Somehow, after writing my ideas on that, I'd watched the second X-Men movie, then Last Stand, then First Class, and then Days of Future Past, Dark Phoenix, and Apocalypse. Yes, I watched them in the wrong order, so things get a little bit blurry around there. On top of this, there were some of the 90s animated series peppered in here and there. I don't know what happened, but here we are, so we're going to have a bit of a look at how rights and liberation fit into the X-Men universe, but with most of the focus on the first movie, but throwing in some moments from the other ones and the cartoons where I feel like it's interesting or like it illustrates something well. Major spoilers for the first movie, and also for some scenes from First Class, Days of Future Past, and Apocalypse. The X-Men series in general covers the themes of rights versus liberation a lot, and there's a lot to unpack here since the central premise throughout the movies really is a group of marginalised people being targeted by a government that wants to at least track and imprison them, and the proponents of letting the government just do their thing and let's see what happens being our heroes, and the folks who want to stop their own oppression by any means necessary being our villains. Because I seem to constantly find myself wanting to talk about Marvel movies for some reason, I once again need to have another reminder that Marvel is owned by Disney, and Disney is part of the boycott list for Palestine. So please don't pay to see any of their movies, don't buy merch from them, and cancel your Disney Plus subscription if you have one. I feel like a good place to start with this is to look at the goals of the two factions within the movies, the X-Men and the Brotherhood of Mutants, and also to see how they're categorized in the short description of the first movie on IMDb, which reads, "In a world where mutants, evolved superpowered humans, exist and are discriminated against, two groups form for an inevitable clash, the supremacist Brotherhood and the pacifist X-Men." In the first movie, both groups are responding to a bill being voted on by the US Senate that would require mutants to register their information onto a database, something which we know is a tactic of authoritarian and fascist governments to control groups of marginalised people, against a backdrop of there being a moral panic whipped up about mutants being dangerous to non-mutant humans. The Brotherhood of Mutants wants to use a machine that irradiates humans to create mutations in them so that all of the people in power at a UN summit in New York will then also be mutants and that then their fate will be interlinked. The idea here is that if the politicians have to share in the stigma that they're helping to create, they might not choose to harm the mutant community in the way they otherwise might. Magneto, the leader of the Brotherhood of Mutants, has some lines in this movie that suggest that he has mutant supremacist values, and this waxes and wanes throughout his story across the series. Also, his backstory is as a Holocaust survivor who saw unimaginable suffering at the hands of a fascist state. He's seen the absolute worst of humanity and obviously carries the trauma of that, which isn't really addressed as an understandable motivation for why he would be particularly aware of witnessing a slide into fascism before others might notice it, and why he might have a particularly strong drive to protect himself and those close to him from structures acting as a potentially existential threat to them. Despite things playing out across the movies very much as he warns, I don't think that we're ever meant to think that he was right, and that he had the necessary experience to recognise this threat where others didn't. The X-Men, on the other hand, only seem concerned with preventing the actions of Magneto and the Brotherhood of Mutants, rather than focusing on what could happen to the mutant community because of the government. Throughout the film, Magneto keeps trying to convince head of the X-Men, Professor Xavier, of how dangerous the bill is to all of them, and the potential consequences that it could lead to, at one point saying, "If this bill passes, you'll be in chains with a number burned into your forehead." But Professor Xavier keeps hand-waving his very legitimate concerns, just confidently replying, "It won't be that way." At one point, he flat out tells Magneto that it won't be like the fascism that he has already experienced in his own lifetime, because humans have evolved since then. We never see any evidence of this presented in the movie, and in fact the humans that we do see are openly bigoted and hostile towards mutants. both systemically in politicians using their power against mutants, and individually with a bar owner aiming a gun at Wolverine's head and telling him to get out of his bar because he is a mutant. Professor Xavier is essentially saying this to bat for us, the audience, because of course our society wouldn't hate and fear and discriminate against mutants, which I think is probably true. I can't really imagine people watching the movie and siding with the fictional government. I think that those same people could very easily think that trans people or migrants in the real world are a danger that need to be dealt with, because we as humans can be really short sighted in translating what we believe in fiction to what we believe in reality. So, getting back to IMDb labeling the X-Men as pacifist, I'm not sure that true pacifism can really exist in the world because not fighting back against violence is allowing violence to happen, even if you aren't the one enacting that violence. Even though I would have really high standards for what I would understand as pacifism, I do not see any way that the X-Men could be considered pacifists at all, when not only are they content to allow violence to be enacted on others so long as it's in hidden systemic ways, like discrimination, they also support state violence against the Brotherhood of Mutants and actively engage in violence against them themselves. One scene that really stands out to me that illustrates this is when Magneto and co. step out of a building to scores of cops who demand that they surrender themselves to be imprisoned by the state. Magneto uses his magnetic powers to lift and smash multiple police cars, and then multiple cops draw various guns aiming at him and his companions. Because of the cops threatening them with guns, Magneto then uses his power to remove the guns from their grasp and turns them on the police officers. He is reversing the exact threat of violence that had been levelled against them, but when it's an individual threatening violence against the established, accepted, and ordered violence of the state, this is framed as violence to be prevented by the X-Men, because the state no longer has that monopoly on violence. Professor Xavier is watching this happen from a nearby car and uses his telepathic powers to enter the mind of another mutant without their consent, controlling his body to make him choke Magneto. This, to me, reads as far more of an act of violence than Magneto turning the cops' own guns against them, because it's taking away someone's autonomy, forcing them to do something against their own will and conscience, and also putting this group at more risk from police violence. But it isn't framed this way by the movie. Professor X forcing Saber to hurt Magneto, I think, is meant to be seen as preventing violence, because it stops Magneto from killing cops. Let's remember, killing them with their own guns. The X-Men will allow and support all kinds of violence so long as that violence is in service of maintaining the status quo, but it's all written in such a way that I don't think that we're meant to understand this as violence in itself. Instead, we're encouraged to see it as preventing violence. This is a recurring motif that happens a lot through the X-Men movies, where Magneto will just try to send the violence of the state back to sender. We see it here with guns, but in X-Men First Class, we're treated to a glorious spectacle of him reversing missiles in midair. Again, because of Professor Xavier's interventions, the state is always protected from their own violence, and it's constantly disappointing me personally as a viewer. I get really confused over whether other people see these movies and are happy that the catharsis of the police or the military destroying themselves with their own weapons doesn't happen, as though it's a victory for the X-Men and us as an audience. Yay, we didn't get to see the really fun thing happen. Thanks, X-Men! Essentially, we have a massive divide in the values of the groups, how they perceive the world, and how they think is appropriate to act in response to what they believe is happening. The X-Men seem to have trust in the established systems and are more keen to fight other mutants who they believe make them look bad to humans to preserve the status quo, and trust in the process that everything will turn out okay. This maps onto real-world non-violent activism, where the goal is to be passive in the face of violence from the state in the hope that activists can be pure enough victims they will make the state look bad enough that they'll change course, and it aims to target very particular individual issues to win rights or changes from the state, rather than looking for anything that could dismantle the underlying systems that create injustice and inequality, like capitalism. When your strategy is having to be a faultless victim in your own oppression, it becomes easy to fight others within your community who don't want to play the respectability politics game of being polite and never fighting back. When Senator Kelly, a key player in trying to pass the bill against the mutant community, is captured by the Brotherhood of Mutants, he even says to them that they can't hurt him because it will prove everything that he said right, because he also thinks that the optics are important. If he'd been dealing with the X-Men or proponents of nonviolence in the real world, he'd be right, because they value how they're viewed by the media, those in power, court of public opinion enough for that to be the key factor in how they choose their tactics. The X-Men and their ilk are so keen to convince the powers that be that they're the good ones, separating themselves from others in their community to gain favor with their own oppressors. This is seen in Professor Xavier telling Senator Kelly, "We're not what you think, not all of us." Professor X also uses the same language as Senator Kelly in describing non-mutants as normal, which suggests that he has also internalized the values of the dominant culture and that the X-Men kind of map onto marginalized groups in the real world who see the goal as to assimilate. Obviously, when you have a story about people who are different than other people around them, who feel ostracized and long for a sense of community, it feels like an allegory for being LGBT. The X-Men would be the more pacified assimilationist gay rights movement that came after the Stonewall riots, when they wanted to be treated as normal and integrated into the same society that had been oppressing them. This involved having to distance themselves from the bad queers who wanted to liberate themselves from the society that was oppressing them by dismantling all the things that were harming people in their community, including gender roles, policing, and capitalism in general. The Brotherhood of Mutants have to be written as though they're human-hating mutant supremacists, rather than allowing them to just be in pursuit of their own liberation by any means necessary, because without them seeming like a threat to humans in general, they would probably seem a lot more reasonable, sympathetic, and be a lot harder to cast as villains. It sidesteps a lot of moral quandaries to write characters who tip over into wanting revenge and the domination of others, instead of just characters who are fighting for their own liberation by any means. It's harder to argue with someone just wanting to be free, and far easier to argue against the straw man that writers set up for themselves, where radicals want to be free by putting others in chains. We can see another really clear example of this in X-Men Apocalypse, where the character Apocalypse disarms all nuclear weapons on Earth. Is for some reason doing that in order to actually destroy the planet. Him using mind control for nuclear disarmament undermines the sanctity of neoliberal democracy, so it must be bad. But it's harder to frame destroying all nuclear weapons as an act of terror when the end result is that no one can use nuclear weapons against anyone, so it has to be that he's doing it to destroy the entire world. It also helps the writers and the audience to sidestep the fact that Professor X has always had the power to disarm all nuclear weapons, but has never seen fit to use it. Because keeping things the way they are, even if that's in the kind of peril where some individuals have it in their power to annihilate all life on Earth, that's their right actually. Because it's how our society works. And where would we be if it didn't work like that? Some kind of anarchy? That's why we can't be allowed to see characters just fighting for liberation without the little evil bit tacked on at the end, because it might give us ideas. Because we don't see genuine liberation put forward in media, I think it makes it harder for people to envision it as a possibility, which I don't think is accidental. Being able to imagine something is the first step in being able to enact the changes to make it a reality. So being able to control ideas by miscommunicating them or flattening concepts so that they obfuscate more radical options makes it harder to believe that they are actually possible, if you can even imagine them at all. I've noticed that, for various reasons, people often use incorrect language for what they're trying to describe, with a notable instance of this being a confusion between the concepts of rights and liberation, which are often used interchangeably by some activists, when actually at their core they are incompatible. Rights require an authority to create and maintain those rights, and liberation seeks freedom from such powers entirely. Liberation involves entirely changing the society we live in to remove existing power structures that create and maintain the oppression of marginalised people, building something else entirely that ensures everyone has access to the things they materially need to live a healthy, safe, and fulfilling life. Liberation is not compatible with structures that harm others, for example, capitalism, colonialism, imperialism, borders, and policing. Unfortunately, I don't think this is what the Brotherhood of Mutants is going for, but I really wish that it was, because it would be a more interesting story than forcing complex and sympathetic characters into villain roles. Largely, the casualties of the Brotherhood of Mutants in the first movie are politicians and cops. The people who have made their choices to be on the front line of enforcing discrimination against mutants, with the only target outside of this being using Rogue against her will to power the machine, which will kill her. At one point, Wolverine suggests that if Magneto really believes in what he's doing, he should be the one in the machine. And it made me think of how differently the movie would read if he did put himself in danger rather than forcing someone else into that position, and how much more justifiable both their position and their methods would be. It's worth mentioning, though, throughout the series, Magneto does put himself at risk with prisoner solidarity because he is constantly going out of his way to liberate other mutants from prisons, including mutants that he doesn't know or that could be a threat to him in the future. In the animated series, he even tries to free Beast, who is a part of the X-Men, from a mutant control agency prison. Hilariously, Beast won't go with him and actively puts his own shackles back on, saying that him and Professor X think it's best for him to wait for his day in court because that will strengthen their cause. At that moment, I was like, is this all a big joke at the expense of non-violence activists? Are the writers poking a bit of fun here? I can't tell because the reality of non-violence feels so absurd. It's hard to tell what's meant to be a joke and what's meant to actually be putting forward that position with a straight face. Another piece of noteworthy information about Magneto's plan in the first movie is that even the X-Men concede that Magneto doesn't know that his machine not only causes mutations in humans, but that it also damages them in ways that cause the mutations to kill them. He literally just wants the people who control the fate of his community to have to be invested in that community and share in the stigma that they, as politicians, are creating for mutants. There's a moment in the film where Mystique is on a plane with Senator Kelly and she shapeshifts to reveal her true form and says something like, "People like you are the reason I was scared to go to school," for attacking him. And it hits really hard. I don't know how anyone can see that and not feel the pain and catharsis of finally being in a position to confront the kind of authority that has instilled that trauma in you. Make them understand that their actions have consequences on other people, that they may one day not be insulated from also suffering some consequences. There is nothing that any of the heroes in this movie do that ever make me feel moved in any way. I don't feel that whatever otherness they're meant to have resonates with me. But seeing Mystique kicking Senator Kelly in the face carries a kind of elation with it. I see my queerness and neurodivergence in the villains of this movie, but never in the heroes. The climax of the first movie is the factions fighting on the Statue of Liberty, with Magneto revealing to Rogue that he first saw the statue in 1949 and that America was going to be a land of tolerance, opening up the idea of the disappointment and betrayal that he must have experienced as a Holocaust survivor, having the lie of the American dream instill hope in him to then find the authority in America still functioned in the same way and was on the path to fascism. Part of the fundamental disagreement between the X-Men and the Brotherhood of Mutants, between liberals and leftists, is not understanding that the default end state of neoliberal capitalist governments is fascism. because fascism is just capitalism in decay. It's frightening to recognise it, but there will always be a point where capitalism has cut public services, exacerbated poverty so much that people are willing to back anyone that they think can change that. The two-party system means that people become disillusioned when they never see any improvement to their quality of life, because both liberals and conservatives function primarily to serve capitalism, not people. This unfortunately allows fascists to step into that void and promise a return to some golden age if we can just oust whatever marginalised group they've decided to pin society's downfall on. These ideas were really solidified for me when noticing that the climax of X-Men Days of Future Past has a very similar feel, being set at a political rally in front of a giant US flag altered to have the Trask Industry logo incorporated into it. It feels like returning to this same fight to protect the idea of America, capitalism, neoliberal democracy, despite every instance of harm we see this cause throughout the movies. It's so confusing hearing the national anthem playing and seeing all the Americana plastered everywhere, knowing that we're supposed to want there not to be an assassination here. At the point where the flags are dropped to reveal the Sentinel robots, which have been laced with metals by Magneto so that he can control them, and they start firing on the crowd of humans, I think this is written in such a way that we're supposed to see them as neutral bystanders caught up in this terrible act of political violence. But let's remember that these are people attending an event hosted by the government and Trask Industries to unveil robots intended to exterminate part of the population. These people have chosen a side. They are people actively cheering on fascism. No one who is happy for technology to be used to harm some section of the population is entitled to feel safe that it won't be used on them, because eventually it probably will be. Once the state has the ability to carry out these plans, the group that they want to use them on can change whenever they want. Once you build a prison, it has to be filled. Once Dr. Trask, the creator of the Sentinel robots, and the president have been whisked away to the White House bunker by scores of bodyguards and Secret Service agents, there's such a catharsis of seeing that metal bunker ripped from the building and dragged outside by Magneto, thrown onto the lawn, ready for them to face some consequences. But of course, those consequences can never actually manifest because the movies are being written as though not harming those who would harm you is always the morally superior option. Days of Future Past has a really strange message where essentially the central premise is sending characters back in time to prevent Mystique from killing Trask, who creates the Sentinels which wipe out the majority of mutants. It presents the logic that the assassination needs to be prevented because Mystique is subsequently captured, tortured, and experimented on, allowing the Sentinels to use her DNA to be an even stronger weapon. There's never any consideration of preventing Mystique from being tortured and experimented on by making sure that she can successfully carry out her plan and also not be captured. It's all focused on protecting Trask as though being merciful to someone who wants to exterminate everyone like you is being a good person. It wants us to believe that being peaceful will always cause your oppressor to be peaceful back, which is obviously untrue, but media in general desperately needs to prop up this idea because it keeps things as they are. It teaches people they're heroic for being passive and a villain for meeting violence with violence, even if that's what would protect yourself and others. As far as I'm concerned, if everyone in that bunker other than Mystique could have just been crushed into a tiny little garbage cube of little garbage people, it's the ending I wanted to see. I don't know why these movies keep setting these scenes up just to disappoint me. Doesn't everyone want to see this? Another really good example from Days of Future Past is Mystique is about to kill Stryker, but is deliberately interrupted, with the implication being that stopping her was a good thing. But killing Stryker at that point in time would prevent the torture and forced experimentation of multiple mutants. His life doesn't get to be worth more than theirs just because killing him would be disorderly violence. Throughout all the movies, we're seeing a fight to preserve the status quo. And in the first movie particularly, we're also seeing a fight over Rogue's fate. which we can see as fighting for the hearts and minds of young people. The X-Men want to create an insular environment for young mutants where they're safe from the outside world, but also where they can condition them into their own values about how to use their powers and ensure that more radical currents can't be allowed to flourish. It's also very directly doing this for the audience. Young people who feel different in some way are probably going to feel drawn to these movies and want the sense of wish fulfillment of having a community, and are maybe on some level looking to see ideas about how society will treat them and how they should act in response to that. The movie can only show these folks that the proper way to fight your own oppression is through the proper designated channels, and aiming to assimilate to a society that may be trying to kill you. It doesn't have the aim of actually showing people what would work in stopping these things. It's aiming to limit the scope for what is possible to the X-Men's way of doing things being heroic, and the Brotherhood of Mutants' way of doing things being villainous. Magneto recognizes what is happening within the US government for what it is, an existential threat to his community, whereas Professor Xavier believes in the system and that the checks and balances mean that nothing terrible could ever happen under the kind of democracy in America. I think anyone would find it hard to argue that Magneto using his powers against a fascist government is unethical or a moral failing, or that he should feel bad or guilty. Although saying that, Professor X does seem to think it's wrong for Magneto to kill a literal Nazi who tortured him and killed his family. But I think that many people only see it as acceptable because of hindsight, allowing us all to agree that Nazi Germany has been definitively categorized as being fascist. When things are happening in our own time, we don't have that kind of distance to look back on an entire series of events. We can only judge it by what's currently happening, and evidently in the world that we're currently living in, many people really struggle to draw any kind of line and call things what they are when seeing it in real time. Also, there's just the general everyday background violence that has been normalised by how capitalism functions, from being forced to work to survive, to corporations destroying our planet, to police being able to take our freedom. Essentially, ordered violence enacted by the state is seen as peace by the X-Men, and presumably by the writers who also encourage this view in us by framing them as our heroes. The only character who really seems to grapple with this throughout the movie series is Mystique, who has the absolute iconic line in Apocalypse where she tells Professor X, "Just because there isn't a war doesn't mean there's peace." Even though Mystique thinks about things in ways that others don't, and her actions seem to match her beliefs more consistently than any of the other characters, she is constantly undermined and framed as someone who doesn't know their own mind, is being manipulated, and needs to be saved from herself. Because could we really have a self-possessed character who has thought things through and just come to the conclusion that violence might be the only way? It's just not something that it's possible to outwardly advocate for. In the same way that movies and comics have been subject to codes that dictate the kinds of morals and behaviors that are acceptable to portray, we're not going to get mainstream Marvel movies saying that by any means is justifiable. In the authoritarian state that we're in the world, anything that hinted at that might be seen as encouraging radicalization. Terrorism, even! But what if we hear what Mystique is saying, and despite how the movie tries to frame it to us, we just think that her views resonate the most, that they make the most sense? We've still ended up with those ideas from a Marvel movie, even if we weren't supposed to. We don't have to like or agree with the intended message that is being presented to us in media for it to spark more ideas in us, to encourage dialogue that allows us to form our own opinions that might not be in line with what the writers wanted us to go away with. In the world of the X-Men, the fact that the government has the power to harm mutants if they ever want to is never seen as an unacceptable level of power that should have never come about in the first place, and that power needs to be dismantled. The writers don't believe that neoliberalism is on its way inevitably towards fascism, and therefore fighting it while it's in this incarnation is always seen as too radical. It would be against democracy, and democracy is seen as in some way sacred, even though it's always a valid choice to vote to harm whoever you'd like. Under these ideas, it's only acceptable to fight back once everyone is definitely sure that it was fascism, when the harm is already starkly evident. And I think that living through world events right now has shown us all how willing to look away or deny fascism people can be. I don't think that many people would try to argue that the secret police in Nazi Germany weren't fascist, but many people still can't accept ICE agents are, let alone starting to look at police on a broader basis. By seeing our characters fight on the Statue of Liberty, we're seeing a fight between what we're told to believe about America, that it's tolerant, that there's equality, that anyone can succeed there and not be discriminated against, that you can be free, and the values that you hold about America when you realize that that's a lie, that it's built on genocide, stolen land, and slavery, that every society is a prison. I can see why it's so uncomfortable to really reckon with those things, particularly when having to fight against the level of social conditioning and media brainwashing that upholds the idea of America, and why people would fight so hard to keep believing in that, even when shown evidence to the contrary, especially when having to address one's own complicity in that and what happens next. I know that this is a movie made in 2000, but still, I don't want to see characters who are supposed to be our heroes defending oppressors. I would categorize the central conflict in the first movie as being about whether the mutant registration bill will pass. But I don't think that that's really how it's written. The only follow up that we get about this element of the plot is a short news broadcast on a television showing Mystique shapeshifted as Senator Kelly, giving a press conference saying that he'd been wrong to support the bill, and the focus is very much just on the exposition that Mystique is acting as the senator, which the X-Men watching the report see as a negative thing, even though her taking that action has removed the voice of the most vocal proponent of the bill, and that may cause it to not go into law. Because the X-Men are stand-ins for liberals, the idea of undermining democracy in this way is automatically an act of villainy, even when done to protect others. Despite that democracy allows for massive harm if enough people want it, and there's no option to withdraw your consent and not participate in it, because it's normalised, unseen, and ordered violence, the X-Men are behind it. Whether the bill passes or not doesn't seem to be of any concern to the X-Men, only that they stopped Magneto and the Brotherhood of Mutants from taking any action that they thought could stop it. The first movie ends with Magneto thwarted and imprisoned by the state, where Professor Xavier goes to visit him in his cell. Magneto asks whether he wakes in the night to thoughts of that law or one just like it passing and someone coming to round up him and his children at the school. When confronted about what he thinks about the prospect of that happening, Professor X replies, "I feel a great swell of pity for the poor soul that comes to that school looking for trouble." Which made me do a little double take when I first saw it, because it seems so out of touch with how he's behaved through the whole movie. But then I realised, I guess it means that Professor Xavier is one of those people who will only act when something directly affects him and those close to him. Only when it's people coming to his door to harm him or the children that he's directly responsible for does it become real to him and something that he has to address. And until that point, it's hypothetical. And seemingly, even those feeling that direct pressure before him and seeing those signs should remain passive until it's too late. And this is from someone whose power supposedly gives him some kind of a connection to every person on the planet, to share in their thoughts, their emotions. The fact that he has so much more capacity for true empathy and still behaves with no care for other people makes him the worst kind of villain. Professor X isn't a hero, he's a class traitor. Thanks for listening to my hot takes on a movie from 26 years ago. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. As a tiny anarchist rat and a tiny content creator, any likes, subscribes, and comments are hugely appreciated and let me know that I'm not just screaming into the void. Hopefully it will reach folks who are interested and I can keep on making weird little videos like this because I watched far too much X-Men content and I still really need to talk about it. See you in the next one. Rat.